look at the results of the Ontario election and what it might mean for federal politics and Conservative politics around the country. I'm joined now by Peter Graefe. He is a political science professor at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. Peter Graefe, thanks for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Let's start with, let's look at, because I want to get to the federal level, but what do you think was Doug Ford's winning formula for his victory last night? What was it that cost him this fairly decisive victory and a second majority?
I mean, I think you could say two things. I mean, one thing strategically, the Conservatives knew that they had their votes, right? That if an election where you didn't have a huge turnout, but you could turn out your voters, you'd do fine. And I think he knew that there's about 40% of the electorate that he could go and get, and he managed to turn them out. Whereas the opposition parties weren't able to do that. I mean, Ford won, in fact, with fewer votes last night than the NDP got in the 2018, campaign. With a lower turnout, but knowing your voters, that makes a difference. But that only works, obviously, if that, other 55% of the population that didn't vote is not really motivated to vote. And so the fact that, generally speaking, people felt he had done an okay job at managing the pandemic, the economy was doing better. There's announcements of new investments in the auto sector by the federal and provincial governments, and then by the major auto companies. All those things, I think, produced sufficient confidence that a lot of people weren't really felt the need to go and vote and stayed home.
Okay, I was going to ask you, many people have said as well that this is partly attributable to a splitting of the vote in terms of the Liberals and the NDP, and also maybe both leaders not having the resonance they had hoped to have in the population. We have both leaders, Andrew Horwath and Stephen Del Duca, both stepping down as leaders as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the strategy for these parties, as in federal campaigns, is you take the first couple of weeks to see which is going to be the leading non-conservative party. And that party spends the rest of the campaign running against the Conservatives. But the problem for both the NDP and the Liberals this time is that neither of them made any traction. There was no, Andrea Horwath couldn't convince Liberals to vote for the NDP. Stephen Del Duca couldn't really even convince people who thought of themselves as Liberals to vote for the Liberals. And so there was no movement in that, and as a result, I don't think they really got in front of the population to convince the population about why they needed a change of government. So even if polls said 60% of Ontarians wanted a change of government, neither of those leaders were able to take that. Again, 55% of the Ontario electorate that didn't go and vote and convince them that that was a reason to go out and vote last night. I mean, there were 6 million people in Ontario who were eligible to vote and didn't vote. Had either the Liberals or the NDP got a million of those, they'd be government today.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's look at the federal level. Are there any lessons in this victory for the federal Conservatives? Well,
I mean, you could look at it two ways. I mean, on the one hand, Ford does very well because the Liberal Party imploded provincially in 2018, as governing parties tend to do, and presumably eventually the Trudeau Liberals are going to have the same difficulty that the Chrétien and Martin ones did, and there'll be an opportunity for the Conservatives to win those seats. So maybe they don't have to do anything; they just have to wait long enough for the Liberals to wear out their welcome. The other way is to say, well, look at what Doug Ford didn't talk about. Right? He didn't talk about abortion. He didn't talk about sex ed. He didn't talk about guns. He didn't really talk about cutting government programs or how government was too big. He didn't even really talk about cutting taxes. So, there's a lot of important issues that we're seeing in the Conservative leadership race, which, were, quite deliberately not part of the Conservative offer provincially. So, part of it, too, may be for the federal Conservative Party to think about what actually could win an election in those ridings if they don't just want to wait for the Liberal Party to wear out its welcome and fall down.
Okay, another thing has been suggested, and I wonder, and that is, I mean, obviously in the federal Conservative leadership race, there is this issue of libertarian or freedom, personal freedoms, and a lot of that was engendered as a result of the pandemic and vaccine mandates, and all of the restrictions and all of that. There are candidates who are largely fueled by a lot of very, very angry people who are insistent on individual liberties and sort of a libertarian streak. Doug Ford didn't have that kind of, the pandemic didn't raise the issues that way for Doug Ford. I mean, he was seen as largely, I don't know, he had his ups and downs during the pandemic, but he wasn't associated, for example, with a libertarian anti-vaccine mandate crowd.
No, I mean, if anything, having those people yelling at him was a benefit to him, because he could portray himself as someone who was trying hard to do the best And so even if, people criticized him for, not acting, early enough or, delaying things so that things had to be shut down more than they should be, overall, he seemed pretty centrist, middle of the road, supporting public health. I think that, that broadened his appeal, having those people criticizing him. It obviously plays a bit differently in a federal campaign, but one could imagine that, Justin Trudeau would be happy to have a Conservative Party that made that their language, because, there's presumably some people on the edges of the Conservative coalition or Liberals who might want to vote Conservative, just to see a change of government, who are going to be put off by that kind of positioning.
Okay, so you mentioned Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. Let's look at it from their point of view. A lot of the people who voted for Doug Ford also voted federally for Justin Trudeau. Is there a lesson or any warning bells that might be going off in Liberal quarters, in Justin Trudeau's quarters, looking at this resounding victory provincially for Doug Ford? Is there anything he should be wary of? Doug Ford campaigned on development and the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that, Trudeau would receive similar benefits that Ford did on that kind of question of the economy. I mean, I think, what probably scares Justin Trudeau is much more, the fate of Kathleen Wynne in 2018, or what happened to, Stéphane Dion and Michael Ignatieff, in 15 years ago. That, when the Liberal Party suddenly loses its popularity, and it can do it very quickly, it doesn't have to drop too many points in the GTA, it suddenly loses 40 or 50 seats and goes from being, the party in power to being a party that, barely exists. And so, the issue of voters souring very quickly on a leader is one that maybe it's not Justin Trudeau's concern, but maybe people in the Liberal Party have to ask themselves, at what point might Justin Trudeau become a liability and produce, that kind of blue wave in Ontario, which is not just about losing an election, but can be very hard to get. As the federal Liberals saw, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and as the provincial party is seeing through this past two elections.
Okay, Peter Graefe, I want to thank you very much. Very interesting. We will follow this, obviously, with great interest. Thanks for speaking with us.
You're welcome.